Let's turn to Genesis in chapter 1. Genesis in chapter 1, and in this hour we're going to be speaking of the first great covenant of Scripture, which I will call the covenant of life. You might read some books that will call it the covenant of creation. Doesn't really matter. Call it what you like. The covenant of beginnings, if you like. But it is the beginning of all covenants. Genesis chapter 1. And let's read from verse 26. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him, male and female he created them. And God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth, subdue it, have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves upon the earth." There you have at least the beginning of what we are calling the covenant of life. It has got to be understood in order to explain all the others. It is a fallacy to believe that the gospel begins in Matthew. If I only begin with the New Testament, and if I do not understand where the New Testament comes from, then I can be very much at sea in many of its concepts. You might say that the Old Testament is the bulb out of which the beautiful flower grows. And there are times as you look at the Old Testament that you cannot see where the New Testament is there. Have you ever taken bulbs? It's about this time of year. If you're a gardener, you take a bulb and you exercise a lot of faith, because you've got that catalog that shows you the most beautiful daffodils and hyacinths, and you've got that most disgusting brown ugly thing in your hand, and they tell you that this is that. It's no wonder you bury it in the ground and try and forget it. But out of that brown ugly thing there comes the most glorious flower. In a very real sense, the Old Testament is the bulb. And sometimes it drags, and sometimes I feel I'll never make through it. It's so boring. But really and truly, when you begin to see what it's saying, out of that bulb comes the beautiful flower of the New Testament, the New Covenant. And you can't cut it off. God doesn't have any cut flowers. If you're going to understand the flower, you've got to get to the bulb. And so the covenants that carefully prepare me and introduce me to the beauty of the new covenant that we now live in, they're all found in the Old Testament. And the beginning of the beginning of the beginning is the covenant of creation, the covenant of life. Now, before anyone asks me, let me say it, that the word covenant does not appear in these chapters that would deal with the covenant of life. And so when I read of creation here, it has nothing to mention about the word covenant. You will find as we go through the covenants that more than once the word covenant does not appear when a covenant is being made. However, it has all the ingredients of a covenant, and afterward it is referred back to as a covenant. The most classic example of that is when we come to the Davidic covenant, the covenant God made with David. At the time, it's never called a covenant. It has the ingredients of a covenant. Every time it's mentioned thereafter, it's looked back at as a covenant. So here, there is no mention of the word covenant. Yet, other scriptures looking back at this call it covenant. So, and let me give you a couple. Jeremiah chapter 33, verses 20, 21, 25, and 24. Let me read it. It says, "Thus saith the Lord," listen carefully, "if you can break my covenant for the day and my covenant for the night, so that day and night will not be at their appointed time. If covenant for day and night stand not, and the fixed patterns of heaven and earth. Okay, that's talking about something else, but he refers back to a covenant that he made that makes the day, day, the night, night, and the fixed patterns of the universe. So he is saying, why does the sun rise in the morning? Why does it set at night? Why can we predict the way the moon will be and the stars will be? Why is it that scientists can tell you the very day that Halley's Comet is going to appear in the sky? Why this order to the universe? And he said it is because God made a covenant that affected the day, the night, and the way things are. Okay? Hosea chapter 6 and verse 7, he says, but like Adam of Genesis, like Adam, they have transgressed the covenant. They have dealt treacherously against me. So God looks at Israel in the days of Hosea, and he says they're acting just like Adam did when he broke the covenant. Well, I go back here and I don't read to the word covenant. But Hosea says, but there was a covenant. And Adam, when he fell in sin, broke the covenant. So you see what I mean? We're going to find here in these early chapters of Genesis ingredients that make for covenant. It's no mention of covenant, but others look back and say, but it was a covenant. It was a covenant God made in creation, speaking of day and night and the way things are, and a covenant that Adam had, which he specifically broke when he fell. Now, what does that tell us? It tells me, first of all, and I get excited about this, when I discovered that the gospel began in Genesis 1, that changed my whole life, and I mean that. I hope it does the same to you. Because if these chapters of Genesis, chapter 1 and 2 of Genesis, are the description of a covenant, suddenly I read them in a completely different way. Think about this. I want you to start thinking now. If that's a covenant, with what we've understood of covenant so far, right? Covenant is a life and death issue. It is the giving of my word. And if I don't keep my word, then I die. It is the sovereignly administered covenant of God. Now, if that's a fact, as Hosea and Jeremiah tell me it is, that chapters 1 and 2 of Genesis are a covenant, then suddenly I realize that God did not merely set the universe in motion and then abandon it. Right? God didn't wind up the universe like a clockwork mouse and say, well, there it is, it's done. Rather, God has committed himself, or to use another part of Scripture which is not referring to this, but is referring to the covenant God, that he swears by himself, because he can swear by no greater. When there was no one else to swear to or tell it about, God swears by himself to himself. He has committed himself to the wise ordering and continuance of this creation. You see, the Christian or the believer is a person that has a worldview different to everybody else. This is my continual upset with most believers. They've never thought beyond the fact their sins are forgiven. For me to come to believe on Jesus Christ radically alters my whole view of everything. And that begins with what I believe about this universe. As far as the average man on the street, as far as the average church attender, this universe is just sort of here. And so we can get scared at the way things are. We can tremble that the universe may be disordered. But the believer knows that God made this universe not in a casual way, but in a covenant-committed way. God is committed to the wise ordering and the wise continuance of this universe until his purpose is fulfilled. It tells me then that this is not, it cannot be based on chance. See, I am not an evolutionist. I can't be when I read this. I'm not even an evolutionist that believes that God ordered evolution, because evolution is a series of dead-end streets. Something starts, flourishes, dies, out, extinct. Now we start again. It's as if that be the case, then God can never quite get it right, but stick around, he'll make man sooner or later. But when I come to this understanding that it's a covenant, that God has committed him, this is not God a dabbler in creation. This isn't God in the garage having a go at making a universe. He is a wise, committed creator, an upholder of all things. Do you see what I'm getting at here? This isn't a chance affair. Man did not arrive here by chance. He is here by a covenant God who committed himself in his wise purposes. Now I understand who man is. Man made in God's image, not a sophisticated ape, but made in the image of God. Why? Why are we here? Why is man? Who is man? If you've never asked that question, you've never grown up. We've got to look in the mirror and say, who am I? Why am I? And look at my neighbor and say, who are we? Whence are we? For what are we? And when I understand this, God made man in his image, put man in his class, in his likeness, in order, see, this is the point, in order to have a covenant relation with him. You see that? He made a universe. He made a covenant with himself. He's not playing with worlds. He's making a universe. And in making the universe, he now makes man within that universe in order to have a covenant relationship. You see, Adam didn't wake up to self-consciousness and then begin to search after. He had a hunch. There might be a God somewhere. I've got a hunch. This feeling I have, there might be a God. So I've got to start searching for him. The idea that you were probably taught in school, this reaching out of man, this experimenting with, there might be a God. Hence all the world religions. No. Man didn't wake up with a hunch there might be a higher being. He is immediately, in the moment of his creation, he is immediately introduced to a personal creator who begins to talk to him, interact with him on a covenant basis. Okay? You follow what I'm getting at here? And you understand who Adam was. He is the human race. We're not now talking, say, about Israel or the church. I'm talking about the human race. Why is man here? To have a covenant relationship with God. Why is man here? To be the covenant Lord of creation. To order this covenantly made creation under a covenant God. That's what it's all about. It puts a new understanding to all the commands that I find in these chapters of Genesis, that God said this, God said that, God said the other. They're not just there because. God doesn't just say them. Each one is a carefully chosen command to his covenant man, shall I say his image bearer, for his highest good. So here we're dealing with a covenant. I said that it has the ingredients of covenant. The main ingredient of the covenant here. See, there's no shedding of blood here, right? In our last hours, we've been saying how there's bloodshedding. Remember why there's bloodshedding? In order that the men making the covenant might understand that this is a matter of life and death, right? He sheds blood to say, if I break this covenant, my blood shall be shed. I shed this blood to say that even if it kills me, I'll keep this covenant. You don't find that in Genesis 1 and 2. But you find the ingredient of life and death, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. In the day that you eat thereof, you shall surely die. Right in the middle of the Garden of Eden, you have the ingredients of covenant, and the main ingredient is life and death bond. God says to Adam, we are in a bond together, and it's a life and death bond. Right? Obey me, you live. Disobey me, you die. Do you really understand me? There's a few blank faces. Do you understand me? This is life and death here. In the light of that life and death bond, you have the terms of the covenant. So you have the ingredients of covenant. Now, who are the persons of the covenant? Well, you have God, obviously. And in this case, we see most clearly that he is the initiator of covenant. The Bible begins with, in the beginning, God. He is the subject of this covenant. And the first chapter of Genesis is emphasizing that fact. He is the creator. He's the one that starts this. And so although I have done many studies concerning those early verses of Genesis from a scientific point of view, I must never miss the great point of that. God. He's mentioned first because he starts this. He, of his own free choice, by no outside pressure, but according to his all-wise, all-knowing, sovereign will, chooses to create. I've often said that in that first chapter of Genesis, you see God at play. You know the difference between work and play? Work you have to do, play you do by choice. Right? God played all through Genesis 1 because no one made him create. He did it sheerly his own glory. He chose freely to create. I read a book the other day, I started to read it. The opening sentence was, God created because he was lonely and he needed a playmate. Well, if that's the case, then God is not complete. He needs man to complete him. Loneliness is the announcement of incompletion. If God was lonely, if God needed man to complete him, then God is not God until man turns up. No, God didn't need man. God, totally complete in himself, the eternal expression of agape love, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, the ever celebration, eternal celebration of love. It was free choice. Free choice. He creates. He willed, spoke, it was so. This is omnipotence. If you would ever see a description of omnipotence, it's Genesis 1. Whenever we create, number one, it has to be there in raw material first. If you build a house, the wood has got to be there, or the mud that makes the bricks. It's got to start off there. It's already made. God started with nothing. I say, I want this done, and I need 5 people between me and doing it to help me do it. So when I say it shall be done, it depends on my authority. How soon shall it be done? God said, let there be. And out of the womb of nothingness, creation is. And it didn't struggle into being. It burst forth, fully made. And so I see Genesis 1, the description of this one who is the initiator of the... He started this. That's a great... And God never builds a road going nowhere. I mean, the world looks pretty much of a mess. But before God started, he knew where it would end. Right? You know? And his wisdom has allowed all this to be. He knows what he's doing. And then he creates man. The agape God creates man in his image in order to impose on that man his blessing and all that is good. And then man is the other party of the covenant. God is the subject, the initiator. Man is the object. This is the one God imposes his covenant on. He's created to be the partner with God in the covenant. And if you've been with us the last hours, you'll know what I'm going to say now. Adam was the covenant representative for all those unborn within him. Do you understand that? Remember this morning, Jonathan, Mephibosheth, not yet born, but he was in Jonathan, therefore he was partaker of the covenant. The human race was inside Adam, unborn, Adam's the covenant representative. Makes a lot of things a lot easier to understand that way. God makes man in his own image. I love that. That's what is so exciting. That I look at you, I look at myself in the mirror, and I understand you now. We were made. Man was not made to be a slave. He was not made to be an ignorant creature who groped after the idea of God. He was made for fellowship with God. Made to walk with God as one. God spoke to man as his familiar friend. You see, to man, God is not completely other. Do you know what I mean by that? In one sense, God is other. God is the awful one. I'm creature, he's creator. I'm mortal, he's immortal. Completely different. Yet in another way, no. For I'm made in his image. I'm in God's class. And although I stand before God feeling my mortality, feeling how much a creature I am before the Creator, yet at the same time, he's not wholly other. He's not completely separated. When man started, when the human race was in the Garden of Eden, they talked and chatted with God as familiar friend. I love this. Adam never had to learn how to know the voice of God. From the very beginning, he knew it like mother's voice. Fantastic, isn't it? We're in God's class, made in the image of God. Man is in the creation. He's part of the creation, yet he's Lord over it at the same time. Animals are only half of his context. You know, who am I? See, well, reduce me to chemicals and there's not much difference between me and my dog. But you see, that's only the beginning of the introduction to the preface of the first volume. My physical is not where I end. I'm in God's class. Adam could name all the animals, but he couldn't find a companion among them because he knew I'm completely different. I'm other than that. What is the image of God? We could spend an hour on that. Let me be very simple. The image of God could be summed up, number one, as everything we call human. That is intelligence, my self-consciousness. You know, when God gave Moses his personal name, do you remember Exodus 3? He says his name was I am. You think about that. I am. Your dog can't say I am. Because to say I am, you have to have the ability to get outside yourself, look at yourself and say, look, I am. Right? Well, try it someday. You know, this is what makes you human. The ability to know that I'm here. Hasn't your dog ever looked in the mirror and barked at itself, thinking it was somebody else? Right? Your dog doesn't know it's there. Right? Okay, now, do you hear what you're doing? This thing you're doing right now, they call it laughter. What is laughter? You couldn't laugh unless you were made in the image of God. He who sits in the heavens shall laugh, and so do we. Why? You laugh because you sat outside of yourself for a minute and looked at yourself and said, isn't that funny? Right? You have to be self-conscious. You have to know I am. You can stand outside and look in. God is the infinite, the eternal I am. And I'm the little I am, made in his image. Self-conscious, everything we mean by human. But essentially, what do I mean when I say the image and the likeness of God? Who is God? Our last hour, we asked the question, who is this covenant God? He is love. And when Adam was made in the image of God, he was a container of agape. That's where Adam was headed for. To be established in, to be rooted, grounded in agape. That's the image of God. I can talk about self-consciousness. That man still has. What he lost in the fall, what means that the image of God has been blitzed and blighted, is that we lost the agape. We lost the glory. Man is a shadow of what he was. Adam in the garden, self-conscious, human, and united with the God who is agape. God was not only his friend, God was the source of his true life. Adam was the expression on earth of the infinite Spirit who is God, the personal one. Man now is that one reflected in flesh, in time, limited. But for all that, you can see. When I understand that, I don't only begin to feel the grandness of the gospel, I begin to take you more seriously. I realize sitting next to me is someone who is a little lower than God. That's what Psalm 8 says. A little lower than God. I mean, watch it. That person sitting next to you, take a sidelong glance. They're made in the image of God. Blighted, I know, with the fall, but still. I mean, they are no animal. Made in the image of God. That's why we get so angry when men act like they do. Speaking of the terrorists, someone said in my hearing the other day in rage, they said they act like animals. I said, thy speech betrayeth thee. I thought you said we were animals. Right? I thought that's what they teach today. Not our Father which art in heaven, but our Father up a tree. Right? I thought that's all we are, sophisticated apes. And yet when a human being acts like an animal, we rage. Why do we rage? Because we know man is made for something higher than that. He was made in the image of God. I wouldn't rage if an ape tore another person apart. Of course, he's acting like an ape. But when a man does it, there's a rage inside. And rage is part of compassion if it's in the right heart. I'm angry that that should ever be. My heart is rent that a man could be like that. And compassion said, it shall never be. And Jesus said, I'll die to stop it. Because we know man is greater. I can look into the eyes of an Iranian terrorist and say, you're made in the image of God, blitzed and blasted. And that's why I rage and I weep when you act like you do. Because I know that you're more than you think you are. Do you follow the reasoning? Well, what are the terms of this covenant? This issue of life and death. The very first part of the announcement is what we read. That God says to his image bearer, he speaks to him and he tells him the specific task that he has. How he's to now live in this covenant that has been made. He says, now be fruitful and multiply. That is, make an awful lot more like yourself. Reproduce yourself. That is, in the context of those chapters, go and make more servants of God. You who are the first servant, covenant servant, now go and make more covenant people. Reproduce yourself. And then administrate the earth for God. The agape has made little agape. Now go and fill the earth with agape. Administer this earth. You are Lord of fishes, Lord of birds, and Lord of animals, and Lord of the planet. Do it in agape. Exercise dominion over all creatures. And as you do that, now we didn't read this, but it's all there in the first 2 chapters of Genesis. As you do this, certain things shall be. Now we're talking about, dare I say it, like the guts of life. This is the beginning of the beginning. This is how the whole is to be ordered. And he said, and hear me through on this, one of the most important things here, the whole of man's life was to revolve around the Sabbath. Have you ever noticed that in God made everything? On the 7th day he rested.